Episode 3. This is what's happening. This is what's happened so far since last time. I got another comment from same person, Laurel Rogers. Awesome. Loved it again because it really helped me focus my line of inquiry. She brings up the idea of neural networks, neuronal networks, neurons, that whole brain thing. In the context of it's hard for adults to learn a second language in the same way that babies learn their first because their neural networks are already defined, and they can't accommodate. I'm adding my own words here. I'm not quoting her, so I didn't say any quotes, so don't get angry at me. I'm interpreting what she said liberally. So it's hard. They're already defined within that first language, so it's hard to fit a second language in there. Very true. In fact, I've heard this a lot, many different people. But for some reason, when she said it, something clicked in my brain. Be it half, I'm stubborn, and I will understand them. And so everything that I hear, I just somehow use it to better understand what I want to understand. And the other half is, it makes sense. But what I thought was, so every single human, so I guess I gotta first explain what a neuronal network is from my point of view. So we got tons of neurons, like those things in our brain that we store information in, those little nodes, and they're all connected by dendrites. And I'm certain there's other things that I'm not naming, but I'm just going to say the stuff that makes sense that I know. There's all these dendritic connections that connect neurons in a certain way, and the way that they are connected is the way that they're used. So the relationships that each neuron, the information stored within each neuron has with other neurons. So with language, there's a particular set of there's a particular network or networks that already exist, that is formed as a result of the experience that we have in the process of learning a language. And we all have one, being that we all speak at least one language. And so it is this firmly set neuronal network that makes it difficult for someone to learn a second language. What I'm thinking is, why don't we design a way to learn a second language that uses as much as possible that already existent neuronal network, language related neuronal network in our brain that we all have, every single person has, because you can't be human, or just you can't live, you can't exist, you can't be social creature and not communicate somehow with language. So a system, something that tackled learning a second language, the more it tapped into that already established neuronal network in our brain for our first language, the more it tapped into that, the easier it should be to learn the second language. So instead of trying to force the neuronal network into to accommodate a second language, we have the foreign entity being the second language. We design its introduction into our brain around that neuronal network that already exists. I mean, in a sense, this type of thing is used in other contexts. Like, if you want to introduce a new product to a society, you don't force that society to accept the product. you design the introduction of the product to be accepted naturally by the society. Same thing. That makes a lot of sense to me. I don't see how it would not make sense to anybody. It's just, yeah, there we go. So the in an effort to do this, we need all inquiry about how to learn a language needs to be vetted, curated by something to ensure that it is remaining as close to this original neuronal network as possible. So all the information, all the research, everything that our adult brain uses to tackle the prospect of learning a second language, there needs to be something that's controlling, that's making sure that it's not veering too far from this original path. But the thing is, we don't know what that original path, that original neuronal network really is. I mean, how does a baby learn a language? We have various ideas, right? But there's very little connection between second language environments and first language environments. Very, very little connection. So like, so for me, what I'm going to do is keep my, I'm gonna have like a little baby curator in my head when I'm doing further research. Just like my baby mind is going to look at information and think, is this relevant or is this not relevant? I've actually been doing this already, but for some reason the idea of tapping into what already exists in our mind to learn a second language, like in the context of neuronal networks, it brings it all back. It brings it all together. And when I say I've already done this, I already have thought of what's the impetus for this entire series is basically my critique on the written word, and that's one of the first things that first red light, I guess, that goes off when I am trying to think about, well, how does a baby learn to communicate in its first language? Well, the one thing I know, and everyone knows, is it doesn't touch any form of the written word until it's speaking fluently in its first language. Now, it's not touching the written word out of choice. Like, it has the option. Parents are like, hey, you can learn with the books. There is no option. It's like as if the brain can't recognize the written word. It's not a understandable object to a baby's brain. And we get this. Like, we don't push books into babies' faces before they're speaking. I'm certain maybe people do, but we just get it. We don't do it in general as a society. It's like we first, when they start speaking, then we start pushing books into their faces. Entire societies exist where there is no written word, yet they function perfectly from birth to death with language. So there is more evidence to say that there is no need for written word to learn to speak a language than there is to say that there is need. So right there, yet the entire world of second language acquisition is book oriented, written word oriented. So right there, that's the first thing. If we are to tap into this neuronal network in our mind efficiently in learning a second language, we have to draw a line saying, if you want to learn to speak a second language, if you want to learn to communicate a second language, if you want to learn a second language, do not touch the written word until you are communicating vocally or whatever form you communicate with your hands or your mouth, efficiently, comfortably, because that's how it happens with babies. So that's one thing. So the question then needs to be, well, how? How does one go from 0 to communicating fluently in a language without using the written word? How does one do that? That's a line of inquiry that I'm very interested in having and exploring. Here's another thing that comes up when I'm trying to think about how to tap into this neuronal network that exists in our head. The idea of fluency. See, we say a baby is fluent at around 2 to 3 years because we witness babies speaking comfortably and communicating with its environment with minimal effort, according to the expectations. And prior to that, it's just 1 to 2 word, 3 word, just very short utterances, right? But then we would never say that a baby's fluent in language if that 2 to 3 year old baby was amongst 10-year-olds, or in a board meeting for a big company, or trying to settle a dispute. There's many more instances where a 2 to 3 year old baby would be considered not fluent than there are instances when it is. So clearly fluency is a Plato-y, malleable term, meaning it doesn't really have a definition. Meaning there is no such thing as it, possibly. The idea of fluency can only occur in a context where the goal of language learning is to learn the language. In other words, where there's goals in learning language. So you start out beginner, then you go to conversational, then you go to in whatever the next one, and then the ultimate, you're fluent, right? Yet there is no such thing as being fluent in your native language. Okay? The concept doesn't exist because it changes, it varies depending on who you're with. Especially amongst differing aged groups. Take a 10-year-old and a 20-year-old, and you're going to say the 20-year-old's more fluent. But then you can't use that word in that context. Yet there's clearly a difference in language capability between a 10-year-old and a 30, 40, 50-year-old. There's clearly a difference going on. So there's something about the relationship between language and being human that doesn't involve learning language as a goal. I mean, ask yourself this question. Is a baby thinking, God, I just wish I knew language so that I could... No, a baby doesn't at any moment think in the process before speaking, I just need to speak. I want to learn how to speak. It's like speaking happens. Like stuff is happening in a baby's life, and at the same time, speaking happens. And it's just the speaking changes over time, but it's always happening throughout. As in our lives, with our native language, I use different words today than I used when I was 15. I speak differently. I formulate my sentences differently. My pronunciation may be even a little different. Who knows? So that's another thing. If you want to tap into this neuronal network that already exists in our mind with our first language to learn a second language, this is a hard one. I want to say you can't have the goal be to learn the second language, because that's not what the goal was when we learned our first language. We never had a goal of learning a first language. Language happened as we were doing things. So then the question we need to answer then is, what's happening as language happens? What are we doing in tandem with language. So language is developing in tandem with something else. And then right there, it seems like there's two different neuronal paths then. Language is evolving, language is this path being carved out in our brain is being carved out in parallel with another path. But they're not the same path. Which is why we can study the language path so well, yet have no idea how to answer that question, how does a baby learn it without using a single written word? No idea how to answer that question. So there's something that's not being explored, because I feel like our goal is a bit misdirected. Now, disclaimer here, I should have said this in the beginning. I'm not saying that you can't learn a language if you use written word, or if you have the goal of it to be learning a language. I'm saying it's not going to be the way that we learned our first language. So someone who just uses written language their entire life and just has the goal being of learning to speak a language, or to communicate in a second language, they're going to develop into something. They're going to develop something. There's going to be a product as a result of everything, but it's just not going to be what a baby, or what it's not going to resemble what is our first language. That's all. Just you're creating a different neuronal path in your brain. You're not using your original first language neuronal path as much, and so you're creating a very in this sense both are different. I mean, even if we learned a second language in exactly the same way that we learned our first, it's not going to be the same path. Obviously, there's too many variations between the culture whether it be syntactically or culturally of a second language. Plus, there's too many differences between us now than when we were babies. So it is going to be a different path, but one of them is using our original one more than the other. Because although it's different, it's still language, and so there's going to be a lot of similarities with how we learned our first one. So I guess my goal, so anyone who's interested in exploring this with me, just answer yourself this one question: do you want to explore how to learn a language that is in a way that's as similar to and therefore uses the neuronal path that already exists in our mind as a result of learning our first language, and therefore as a result should be easier, since you're just tapping into already a wealth of resources instead of trying to completely create something yourself, a brand new thing, start from scratch type of thing. Do you want to start from scratch and therefore come up with a completely different product, or do you want to you're going to come up with a completely different product regardless, but do you want to use a wealth of resources that already exist, or do you want to start from scratch? I guess that makes sense. I want to try to use the wealth of resources that already exist. It seems more natural and more enjoyable from my point of view. Plus, we already have enough examples of entire cultures trying to learn a language using almost exclusively written resources, with the goal being to learn a language. You can't exemplify the goal being to learn a language more than a test that tests how well you understand the language. Cultures like Japan, Korea, the ones that I'm familiar with, I'm certain there's many other ones in the world, but the ones that I'm familiar with being those two, that's the bulk of their English language education, is books and tests. And they are notorious for not being able to speak it. That's enough. That's like, what more do you need? Right, well, I don't need more than that to justify a different path of inquiry. Yeah, I don't.